Hi Anel and hi Sandy, just waiting for a few people to come in. Probably wait for you just a minute to let people come in. Might just make a start because we've got quite a lot to get through. So hello everyone. I'm Julie and I'm the Green and Grey coordinator from WEN, and I coordinate the Tower Hamlets Food Growing Network. Really excited to welcome you all to our first community food conversation webinar, and the aim of these is to make sure that we can continue to share insights and keep conversations going on topics related to food growing in Tower Hamlets, with a focus on a different theme for each webinar. Today our theme is access to land. Now, many of you may have used or managed a community growing space, but few will have experienced setting up a new space. We had an autumn gathering in September, which some of you might have come to, and we heard from community garden leaders in Tower Hamlets who started gardens just before or during the pandemic, who spoke about how they were not just spaces where they were able to grow and share good food, but were some of the precious few green spaces people could escape to, and where people got to know their neighbours for the first time after years of living side by side. So for those who've kind of entertained the idea or thinking of establishing a new community growing space, it can be difficult to know where to begin. And the prospect of who and how and what to ask to gain permission to steward a piece of land and how to sustain access afterwards can feel daunting and even prohibitive. As well as the logistical and legal challenges to accessing land, there are also bigger questions such as food insecurity, rewilding, how we relate to the land, and land justice intersecting with racial justice. Obviously, these are huge topics and we won't be able to go into all of them or in detail, but to help us understand a bit more about land access and to answer your questions, we're really pleased to welcome Kate Swade. Kate is the co-director of Shared Assets, a community interest company which believes in creating a future where land is used for common good. So just before I hand over to Kate, I'm really keen for you all to ask questions. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So that's for questions, but also if you want to kind of just chat throughout, say hello to each other and put in your own perspective and insights. And then after Kate's presentation, I'll be putting some questions from the Q&A, but also some that you've submitted already. Kate, thanks so much for joining us. Before we get to your presentation, could I just hear a little bit about you and what Shared Assets does, please?
Sure. Hi, Julie, and hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here. So yeah, my name's Kate. As Julie said, I'm one of the co-directors of Shared Assets. We are a think and do tank, which is shorthand for saying we do a lot of different stuff. And as Julie said, we're really focused on reimagining what the land system could be, what our relationships collectively with land could be. And what that looks like is supporting the development of new models, for new business models and governance models for land. And we do a lot of work, which I suppose you would call consultancy work, both with community organisations who are managing land or who want to get hold of land, but also with landowners like local authorities who are thinking about how they can make their lands better serve the common good, I guess. We also do a lot of research, particularly at the moment into thinking about access to land, often in the context of people wanting to get access to land for farming, but there's lots of kind of crossover relevance there. So I'll talk a little bit about that stuff. And we're also increasingly doing what we call movement building, where recognizing, and I'll talk a little bit about this as well in the presentation, that no matter how good your community garden is, there are still big systemic issues to do with who has access to land and who gets to make decisions about land that are unjust, and that we would like to see a world where those are addressed. So we cover a lot of ground. We're 10 years old this year, and I've been with shared assets since the beginning, but my background was more in community building and property management. And actually my first job in that sector was with an organisation called the Environment Trust, which was based in Shadwell, which went bust in 2008. But I spent about 4 years working in Tower Hamlets with various different community groups as part of the Environment Trust. So although I'm now up in Tottenham, I've got like a lot of a fondness for the borough. So it's really nice to be here. So yeah, that's me.
Great, thanks so much. Would you like to share your screen and then we'll start your presentation, and then I can ask you any questions afterwards?
All right, so if I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this. Cool, so does that, can you see my screen?
Perfect, yeah.
Cool, and what I'll do, I'm really happy to circulate, or for Julie to circulate these slides afterwards. So there may be some bits of these that I kind of gloss over, but that I put in to make sure you had more, that you had a bit of a sort of fuller picture. So I've talked about who we are and what we do. What we want to see is a world, like I said, where land is used for the common good. And we really think that means these 6 things, which will look different in different circumstances. Context is really important, and that's going to be a theme that I come back to again and again, probably in this talk. But we would like to see models of land use that support people's livelihoods, so that aren't just completely volunteer-led, that are really enhancing of the environment, that produce things people need, whether that's like practical things like food or fuel, or social and environmental benefits, that where the benefits of land are shared. And I think this is one of the key things that doesn't happen currently, is that the kind of fruits of the land are not evenly distributed amongst the people, and that that there's some element of community control. And again, that will look different depending on who you are and where you are. And we think that land is at the heart of system change, and that it's a bit ridiculous to think about or talk about changing systems, such as the economic system or the voting system, if we don't also think about how we change people's relationship to land. Julie sent some of the questions that people had asked beforehand, and a number of them were along the lines of why is it so hard to access land? And I wanted to, suppose, to start this before going into some of the more practical stuff by recognizing that we live in a land system, and actually the ways in which decisions about land are made and how it is decided, or how it has sort of turned out, that who has power in that system, so who owns the land and who owns more of the land than other people, is a system that is deeply entrenched and is deeply connected to who has power or who doesn't have power. We live in a country where less than 1% of the population owns 70% of the land. In London, that's a particularly acute, it's particularly acute, particularly around corporate and businesses, corporations and businesses owning a huge amount of land. And fundamentally, where land is seen as an asset, almost like any other, that people can profit from. And that means that other uses of land, particularly those that might be focused on trying to achieve more common good aims and share the benefits rather than concentrate them, often have the system completely stacked against them. So there's as Malcolm X said, land is the basis of freedom and justice and equality. And I'm not going to go into a big kind of political aside, but we can do this in the questions potentially. But I think there is something around part of the reasons it is hard to access land to do good stuff is that the system is weighted against that good stuff happening. So no matter how efficient or effective or strategic you and your community group are, you're operating in a in a stat, you're not operating on a level playing field with, say, a property developer. So anyway, thinking about what are some of the things that you might want to start thinking about if you're trying to get access to land for a new growing project. And as Julie said, there's a lot to say about all of this stuff, so I will be kind of bouncing through it, but we can go into more details. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards as well, but there probably isn't one right answer to any of these questions. It really depends on your context, but some key questions to really start with for me are like, why? Why do you want to access land? And the answers to what you should do will be maybe different depending on the answers to these questions. So I think starting with yourself, like, is this something that you want to access as an individual, potentially for, are we talking that what you really like is an allotment, or that you want to become a horticulturalist or a farmer? Or are you working as part of a group? And if so, what are the aims of that group? And you will share the same motivation. And that's something I'd really encourage people to do if you're working as a group and you're thinking about trying to go down the land, aim of accessing land, really getting down to like, what are your motivations personally? Is it that you want to connect better with your community? Is it that actually this is a political stance against inequality and injustice? Is it that this is your response to climate change? Is it that actually you really want to grow vegetables that you can't find in the shops? None of those motivations are incompatible with each other, but it's really good to be clear about them before you start. And crucially, do you want to be making an enterprise here? Are you trying to set up a community food enterprise, a veg box scheme, something where you'll be supporting your own or other people's livelihoods? Or is this about building connection and primarily relying on volunteers? Again, there's no right or wrong answers there, but like, the answers to those questions will help you kind of navigate the flowchart where you might want to focus your energy on trying to get land. Here is a bit of a checklist of things to ask yourself, which you probably would need to come back to again and again as you refine your search. But really thinking, like, once you know what you need the land for, there's a whole bunch of questions about what kind of land you might need. Like, how big is it? What's the soil like? Or are you going to be growing in raised beds? Has it got enough lights? Is there water connection? How do people access it? Does it have to be in Tower Hamlets? Can it be up in Chingford somewhere? We've been doing a lot of work recently around the concept of fringe farming. So food growing on the edge of cities, and really seeing like the urban fringe as the place where quite substantial like market gardening could happen. Again, so if you wanted to set up a kind of profitable food enterprise, it might be better to be looking in places where there's a bit more land. If what you're really trying to do is deepen your connection to your community, you obviously want to be doing that closer to home. And crucially, what kind of tenure do you either need or are likely to be able to get? Oh, sorry, pressed the wrong thing, over this land. So this is, and I won't go through all of this, but again, like I say, I'll share this. One of the challenges we often find is that people end up investing quite a lot of money or time in making a site fit for purpose, but without having the kind of appropriate level of legal agreement on that land. And I would say that whatever type of land you are doing your project on, you need some kind of clear agreement that sets out what your responsibilities are, what the owner's responsibilities are, and how that agreement can be ended. If you want to be doing things that have a really long-term impact, or that you want to be changing something from, say, a derelict space into a park, or into a kind of public garden, you do want to be looking at some kind of lease arrangement. However, if what you're doing is genuinely kind of edible planting around your neighborhood, then maybe you can just go with the guerrilla gardening, informal agreement type of things. All comes back to what you're trying to do. But again, often one of the things we see, and particularly around public land sometimes is local authorities sort of actively wanting to get rid of responsibility for certain pieces of land and trying to give people who say want to brighten up their neighbourhood overly onerous agreements that hold too many responsibilities. So again, there's no right answer here, but being clear about what you're trying to do and what kind of a relationship with the land you need is going to be really important. Kind of continuing the kind of checklist of things. It's always, I think, important to, if you can, have a bit of a budget for legal advice, particularly around the implications of any agreement you're signing with the landowner. Also, taking some time to really understand that agreement and understand what liabilities you incur, particularly who needs to hold the insurance, and particularly if you're talking about a site where there's going to be some kind of public access, or you're going to be working with tools of some kind. Who's responsible if someone steps on a rake, basically. If you are a community group, as in a bunch of people sitting around a table thinking that you want to do a good thing, then absolutely brilliant. You might want to think about incorporating, so turning yourself into a community interest company or a charitable incorporated organisation to create, essentially to limit the liability of you as individuals and to create a legal person who can enter into contracts, or to partner with a constituted organisation who can support you by entering into those contracts for you. You obviously will probably need some funding, and that's a whole other webinar probably around how you get funding for this kind of thing. And thinking about planning permission, especially if you're wanting to make any permanent structures on the land, you probably will need to engage with the planning system. And again, that's a whole other bunch of complicated stuff, but it's best not to be surprised by it at the end. I won't go into this hugely, but someone again in the questions mentioned that, yeah, getting access to land is only the first bit. Maintaining access to land is often just as hard as getting it. And I completely agree. This access to land pathway is something that's come out of a project we're part of. And a couple of things here. The Access to Land Network is this European network of grassroots organisations. It's got more of a rural focus, but there is quite a lot of interesting stuff on there about how social purpose organisations have accessed land across Europe. So it's just sort of interesting reading. But I think, yeah, recognising that access to land operates within this kind of system of all sorts of different things. And that, yeah, getting access to land is just the beginning of both maintaining it and obviously doing the good stuff that you want to on the land. So that's all some sort of fairly general stuff. So then I was thinking, if you're sitting in Tower Hamlets, where are the places that you're most likely to be able to think about accessing land? There aren't that many pristine sites waiting for your market garden proposition. Meanwhile use is something that comes up quite a lot. This picture here is of the Story Garden in King's Cross, which I'm sure some of you will know. They were initially by King's Cross Station when that redevelopment was happening, and then once that was once they were chucked off that land, they've moved to this site near the British Library. I think they are now trying to find a longer term lease on a piece of land somewhere in Camden or Islington. Meanwhile uses can have lots of pros. You can trial out ideas. You can see if you actually like running a land-based project, if your group really has the skills to actually manage a piece of land. But they also have a number of, I think, considerations. So the key to meanwhile use is the idea that you will leave that land at some point, but really understanding what the legal relationship you have is and how much security you have can both be really important for funding and for just general planning. And that links down to this last point about the implications for community building. If what you're doing is very associated with the immediate area and then you have to leave and set up somewhere else, you may well lose all of that goodwill and that work that you've built up. So your model has to be very much reliant on the fact that you will move, which might make it not appropriate for certain types of land use. Also, if it's a building site, there's often going to be contaminated soil issues. And so growing food in the ground might not be advisable, and you might need to be buying in soil or doing some quite serious composting, which just again adds extra strain on the business model potentially. But there can be, I think, some really good outcomes from doing meanwhile projects. Parks are obviously, you know, a lot of land is parkland, and we actually wrote this guide, which you can get on the Sustain website with Sustain about. It's called a guide for councils, but I think it's really useful if you are seriously thinking as a community organisation that you want to be growing in parks. Some of the things we found there are that most of the parks in this country with substantial or in any way serious food growing projects are relatively large ones. Like, it works best in kind of a large multifunctional park where maybe the land that is taken to grow food isn't missed as much. But it's not, we didn't find any examples of kind of profitable horticultural social enterprises in parks. It was mainly things that were about the kind of community gardening, people connecting with the lands, potentially some sales, but it's generally stuff that needs to be supported in other ways than just by sales. Particular considerations here are, it needs to fit in with the management plan for the whole park, so the council does need to be really involved, and you need proportionate and enabling tenure arrangements. So again, this balance of having enough security to be able to plan and raise money without putting too much onerous pressure on the group themselves. A key consideration is whether it's possible to gate the space or whether it has to be open, and that really affects what kind of model of growing can be put forward. And so that's all park stuff. This last point here about thinking about old nursery spaces, I'm not sure about in Tower Hamlets, but certainly in Haringey and in Waltham Forest, there are some quite substantial community food enterprises that have established themselves on old council nursery sites where the local authority used to grow plants for its parks or for roundabouts and verges and things. And so it's worth looking at kind of infrastructure that used to be associated with parks but that is maybe not currently publicly used. There's a lovely example in West Ham Park where they've done some quite substantial food growing. And yeah, the guide itself is full of kind of tables like this to help you kind of work out where you might place yourself along various different spectrums and therefore what you might need to do. The other big opportunity is housing around, like green or non-green spaces on estates, so walkways, drying areas. There's lots, I think, of potential there. Often it is the onus has to be on the community or the people wanting that to happen to join up various different bits of the council. But there's lots of good examples of how that can happen. This is an estate in Islington where they've created a community plant nursery. And I've put some links further down where there's some good examples that you can kind of get a bit more inspiration from. And I'm sure there will be good projects in Tower Hamlets that you know of where growing on estates is happening. Community engagement is obviously a huge part of this. You're working very close to people's homes, and the sense of what counts as antisocial behaviour might feel very different to people depending on where they live on the estate, and like the issues around safety feel like they need particular attention that again will depend on the context. You can do actually quite substantial things. So Growing Communities in Hackney has its patchwork farm where it creates vegetables for veg boxes across a patchwork of parks and different estates in Hackney. And so you have more potential on estates to actually gate off pieces of land for more social enterprise or more commercial growing, if that's something that people feel that they would like. There's also these lovely people, Go Grow With Love, who've been doing some great work on estates in Tottenham, particularly around Broadwater Farm. And so again, like using the power of growing to really help people change how they see where they live. Okay. Sorry, let me go back up here. No, up. So these, I'm not going to run through these, but just when I send later, that's all the links of some the things that I've mentioned, and there's a few others in there in terms of like interesting projects who've accessed land in urban areas in creative ways. Some other just general resources where there's kind of some more technical advice and technical guides, and then just sort of picking back up on the thread about land justice. There are quite a lot of people out there thinking about the bigger, like, systemic issues and challenges around land and land justice. Two things just to bring your attention to. One is the top one here, Land in Our Names, or LION. It's all about getting access to land and mobilising a network of Black and people of colour land stewards in the UK. And also that this one at the bottom, 3 Acres and a Cow, is a history of land rights through folk songs and stories. And they've got a London show coming up in April. So I'd really recommend that if you're interested in the kind of big systemic issues. So that's my garble through. I'm sure there's lots of questions.
Thanks so much, Kate. That was really brilliant. Yeah, so much in there, and thanks for all those links at the end. I'll make sure that I'll circulate that at the end. We've got quite like loads of really brilliant questions. Some of them you did answer in your presentation. I was just thinking about the food growing in these pieces of land, and what your thoughts are on community food growing as a place to provide food security, because obviously food growing, sometimes they're not massively productive. They've got this kind of massive social value, people getting out into nature and then kind of meeting up with their meeting people. Do you have any thoughts about that, whether that's
so I know there's been quite a lot of academic studies on this, of people actually, and I think, so if you're talking about like inner city, urban community gardens, there's always going to be a size limitation on how big they are, probably, until we end up in a financial crash like Detroit or bits of Cuba, and we start growing food on every piece of vacant land, which, might be possible. And so I think the received wisdom is that inner urban agriculture doesn't contribute hugely to food security, and that is partly why we've been doing quite a lot of work around the peri-urban. So I know that one of Sustain's vision, so peri-urban being like on the edge of towns where there is more land, and historically that is how cities fed themselves. It is, you look at places like Brighton, London, the Lee Valley was London's breadbasket. It was full of market gardens, and people would take their produce to market in town and then sell it there. And so I think there's something quite exciting. And I know, Sustain have this vision of that every London borough should have a peri-urban farm, so that Tower Hamlets should have a farm somewhere like out on the outskirts, and that you could have that connection.
Right.
I think there is a lot of scope in urban areas for things like salad and edible flowers and things that perish or don't travel very easily. But I think probably the primary, and it's also that thing, I have an allotment, and you see the challenges of the allotment year on year, of like, sometimes it's everybody's plots are overflowing, and then last year nothing, all the tomatoes got blight. What we need is not to be growing all of our food on our doorsteps, but we need a system of getting food to people that is much more resilient and interconnected. And as someone popped out in the chat, rooftops I think are a really important thing. We should be growing wherever we can, but I think we also need to be looking at how rural land is used, and how the rural relates to the urban, and how
actually, following on from that, there were two related questions from two different people. So one person said, it's hard to believe that council and the local government are on the people's side when pop-up houses and villages built in a rush are forced upon what was once farmland and greenland in rural areas. How can the communication disconnect be bridged, and how is it legal that so much building on agricultural land is happening all at once on England right now? And then there was somebody else who was also talking about this rural land, and can the council order compulsory purchase of land as a community asset value? And can green spaces be equally important as historic properties? There's a lot in it.
Those are like two massive questions.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of issues tangled up in all of those. I think coming right back to what I was saying at the beginning around we don't actually have any coherent land policy in this country. You have planning policy, but that doesn't deal with agricultural land. It doesn't deal with farming. You have the tax system, but that really deals with what you're doing when you're on the land rather than the land itself. So things like council tax or business rates. And we have we have one of the most unequal distributions of lands in the Western world. At Shared Assets, we're coming from the point of view, we're starting from the point of view that land is a common good and that we should treat it as such, but that is not the way that the government or kind of public policy comes at land. It comes at land as an asset that should be, that you can speculate on and that you can trade. And if you think about it, that's like cognitively really strange. That you can trade, you can buy and sell a piece of land without ever having stepped foot on it. It's the only thing that you can buy or sell that you can't pick up and take with you. And there's lots of people who would say that there's a case for treating land as a different type of asset, as a different type of thing, and not being able to trade it and speculate on it in the same way, because it's that speculation that leads to land prices rising, which leads to house prices rising, which leads to these which leads to the housing crisis, which leads to the scramble to build inappropriate houses on any place that people feel they can get planning permission for it. And so there's huge issues once you start peeling back this stuff. And the problem is that because it's so ubiquitous, because land is everywhere, and we're all so used to the fact that it's expensive and it's hard to get, it's like the weather. You're kind of like, oh yeah, of course I can't afford a house. But actually there's like a whole system of decisions that sit under the fact that people can't afford houses that mean that we're in the situation we're in. So that's like, that doesn't help you when you're trying to like find land for your community garden, but it means it's part of the context, I think, for I think people should be angrier than they are about some of this.
Well, I read this really brilliant essay that you wrote actually on inclusiveness and agroecology and municipal ownership in land use, which is it was on Renewal. That's where I saw it, and I can send that on to people. And this idea of, we know what land is when it's kind of like it's beneath our feet, it's this thing that we know, but when it becomes kind of property, when it becomes like this like concept, and it's like, oh well, people own it and people like trade in it, it becomes this thing that is like loaded with this power that we can't sort of reach, and that's the barrier that we kind of have.
Totally. And that's what then disconnects it. So all of the stuff around gentrification and like so many of those challenges in urban areas are connected to that. So the kind of the way that land has become this really abstract thing that just sits on people's balance sheets, and that's the value it has. And so I think there's a big case for councils to take their role as landowners much more seriously, because they hold this really precious thing, and too often the pressure is on councils to sell the land they own to the private sector in order to deal with austerity, basically, like bridge the gaps in their funding things. And no one can blame them for that, but it's not systemic. And then coming back to that, which comes into that question about compulsory purchase, and yes, local authorities do have the power to compulsorily purchase land. One of the big blockers to that, and actually that power was partly what was used to be able to build all the new towns in the 50s. Like people talk about Letchworth Garden City as being a really interesting example, like the first garden city where the value of the land was held in common rather than by all the individual plot holders. And lots of the new garden cities had similar models until Mrs. Thatcher changed all the rules in the 80s. But there is some movement around trying to reform, I think it's the 1970s Land Compensation Act, because currently if a local authority wants to compulsorily purchase, so force somebody to sell land to them, they have to take into account its hope value in terms of what the value of what it could be used for. Whereas before that, the thing that enabled all of the new towns was that they only had to pay its current use value. So if you've got a derelict site, you would be buying it as a derelict site, whereas at the moment you would be buying it as a potential housing development in Tower Hamlets, which obviously kind of completely inflates value. Local authorities are often quite risk averse. They don't think they have the money, the time, the kind of the risk of sort of intervening in the private property market to enable community-led stuff is something that I think they often find quite challenging. There are examples of it, like Hastings Council compulsorily purchased Hastings Pier off its offshore investors and then back to back transferred it to a community organisation. So they kind of owned it for a minute and then it went to the community organisation. Then the community organisation went bust a few years later and is now in private hands again. So none of this stuff is easy. But yeah, I think I would love to see more attention paid to CPO as a mechanism for that kind of thing.
And just thinking in terms of, we're talking about land justice and like who owns the land, and I've seen, I think you put a link to Lion at the end of your slides. So thinking about this kind of racial and land justice, have you seen a kind of shift in attitude at all from landowners or local authorities to give more like beneficial terms, like longer leases or things like that, to communities who've like previously been disadvantaged? Or have you seen kind of more inclusivity in your land work, or has that kind of been more like, you know, people like Lion pushing that now?
No, that's a really interesting question. So yeah, I think Lion are doing an amazing job at raising the fact that land, like racial justice, needs land justice, and bringing up the question of what would reparations look like in a UK context. So there's quite a lot of talk in an American context about reparations, but in terms of thinking about the fact that the UK's, well, a number of things, but one being that the UK's land system doesn't stop at Dover, right? Like we are completely reliant on the land of other countries to supply many of our basic needs, and that has a knock-on impact in those countries, and that historically a substantial portion, if not most, of the wealth of this country was taken from countries that we colonized, and that then set in train like patterns of migration that mean that people who are here that we have many people in this country today with lots and lots of different backgrounds. And that it's not then coincidental that the white population tends to have, not exclusively, but tends to have more generational wealth and more like inherited wealth, which then gives you a knock-on advantage in the property market, right? And so actually, would reparations in a UK context look exactly like what you were just saying, longer leases, more preferential terms? I've not seen any examples of that actually happening in practice, and I imagine that the Equalities Act would probably have something to say about that. You know, that I was a commissioner on the Liverpool City Region Land Commission, which produced a really interesting report. It's on the, if you Google it, you should be able to find it. But one of the things we recommended there, and I'm not sure if it will be taken up, was that Liverpool in particular obviously had both a huge link to the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, in terms of the wealth of the city, but also has one of the longest standing Black populations in the country, which had, and many of the areas that had been historically Black majority had been treated really poorly by the planning and the housing system. So big clearances, people being moved away, things being knocked down and not rebuilt. And we did argue that there was a case for planning policies that recognise that particular history.
Right.
Again, I don't know if that's been taken up.
Yeah.
So yeah, it feels like it's something people are talking about more, which is great, but I think there's still quite a long way to go in terms of grappling with that stuff.
Okay. See if I've got questions in the chat. David asked a question about using older people's gardens for growing.
Older people, so I see. So like using, so there are, so using other people's land, other people's private gardens and growing food in them.
I guess that's what that means. Yeah.
I mean, there is. Oh, I meant to include it. I don't know. Sorry, I'm just literally googling this thing now. I have no affiliation to this, and I can't vouch for it. But these people, Allotment, have just started a new thing which does supposedly provide that kind of service. So like match people up who have land and people who want land, and I think that does look at back gardens and stuff. And I think a lot of the considerations I mentioned still apply, particularly really working out who what the agreement that you want or you need with those people are, like, and how much sort of permanency you want that arrangement to have, and how everything is kind of how you safeguard both the individual whose garden it is and the person who's doing the growing. But yeah, I think there is potentially stuff that is quite interesting there, and there might be a role for housing associations or something in supporting that to happen. I know often they're concerned, housing associations are kind of concerned about older people not being able to keep their gardens in good condition, you know, and so you could find some creative ways of matching people up there. But I don't personally know of any examples of that have worked.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean there aren't any.
Okay. And some other questions. Got this is interesting. What are your thoughts on using growing as a form of protest, such as seed scattering, rewilding, and land adoption of disused areas? Are these helpful mini protests or not? There was a bit that you wrote about land sharing, and what was it again? Land sharing as well. So whether we kind of leave land to kind of rewild, and it's kind of like, well, we as humans are kind of separate from this, you know, we should kind of back off and let land do its thing, and protect it that way, or that we are very much part of that land and we work with it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of connection to make as well between those two things. So yeah, the land sharing and land sparing thing is kind of two almost worldviews of and I think, yeah, I'm very much on the side of believing that we are part of nature, that we are animals essentially, and that we need relationships with the land, whether that is just sort of staring at some blossom on a tree or growing your own food or whatever. And that I would like to see a system and a future where we are more entangled, there is more wildness in all of our lives, where basically all of our houses look like your backdrop with all of those plants, but that we're and that actually the most sustainable form of farming and food growing and forestry is ones that involve people, and that maybe are involving people in kind of in sort of productive labor on that land as well. So using, you know, working with the land to produce what people need. There is a whole other worldview, which is kind of summed up as this land sparing thing, which actually says that humans are separate from nature, and that in order to save nature, we need to separate ourselves from it even more. And so that vision of a future would be one where people live in increasingly dense cities, and then maybe a third of the land is for dense cities, a third of the land is for intensive agriculture, and the rest is left to rewild. Personally, I find that massively problematic for lots of reasons, and partly because I can't imagine a future like that where we do achieve, say, racial justice, right? Like where we do start to grapple with some of the inherent power dynamics that are massively problematic. And partly because it's sort of always very reliant on technology that we haven't quite invented yet, but that will surely come along and save the day. Whereas actually we have a lot of really good technology now that we could just be using, trees, things like that. And so that question of, should we be using gardening as protest or kind of scattering seeds and things? I'm definitely in the scope. I really think it can't hurt. At worst, it can't hurt. At best, it helps bring that awareness that nature is everywhere into people's lives more, really. I'm a big fan of the whole guerrilla gardening approach. If people going and just sort of planting stuff where they see a need, that can have knock-on challenges if they're not then respecting other people's needs. But roundabouts and dull verges could always use with more. Where I mentioned the Environment Trust, which was the Tower Hamlets Environment Trust that went bust in 2008. We always used to they had their little leaflets and would always staple a little packet of wildflower seeds to everything we put out, and it was just like, scatter these wherever you are. And maybe some of those flowers are still growing now, I don't know. But yeah, I think it's part of it. It's not the whole answer, but it's definitely not a problem, I would say.
Do you think a housing association would buy a farm outside the city for residents to be used in? Maybe residents accommodation, like a hostel.
That would be nice if they could. Yeah. I mean, I think that more, but you do get, you get schools and I don't know about housing associations, but you often get kind of residential centres for urban people, like out in the countryside, right? And often they're focused on adventure of some kind, like, there's sort of, Haringey schools have like an outdoor activity centre somewhere down in Cornwall where they often send kids to go and like do some kayaking or whatever. And it would be really nice to have something a bit closer to home that people could go to more regularly that is about food and food production.
Maybe slightly kind of related question. Do you think people have become complacent, apathetic about the land we're custodians of, or is it the opposite and perhaps you see more caring and connection happening?
I think it really depends on who you are and where you are and what's going on. I think, I think something I do see is people getting involved with their local lands, whether that's in rural or urban areas, and on various different scales. So whether that's, we're going to buy a woodland and become foresters, or I'm going to get involved with the friends of my local park and do a litter pick every so often. I think I do see people doing that as a way of coping with the fact that the world is confusing and potentially destroying itself, and like overwhelmingly, you look around and you read the news and it just feels like there's no point even trying. And actually, going and clearing up some litter or going and planting some stuff is a way for lots of people, I think, to sort of regain a small sense of control. And that sense of like connecting with the place where you are. Like there's some quote, I can't remember who said it, but about like, do what you can with what you've got where you stand. And that thing is, I think that's what attracts people to the land stuff. It's like I have some sense that I am here and I am doing a thing while around me there's pandemics and there's wars and there's corruption and there's massive injustice and there's climate change and biodiversity collapse and oh my god, but like I can. And so I think you can have the apathy and the disconnection and the connection all in the same place, and kind of. And I think you can probably care for perhaps you can be very attentive to your garden but still drop litter on the street. I think that can be that as individuals we can be full of contradictions, basically.
What have we got here? So somebody was asking, I guess specifically for their projects, they were looking for sites for their circular food pilot that they wanted to plan for Tower Hamlets. I guess they're kind of asking if there's somewhere where to find those spaces for growing. Do you know how you would kind of go about sort of like, okay, I've got this idea, where can I find that bit of land?
I mean, that's the $1 million bloody question, actually. Like, I'm just gonna put a link in. I didn't put this in. We've been developing this website called Land Explorer, which is like a map-based platform where you can search for, well, you can kind of overlay different bits of information about land on a map and then kind of move it around. We're integrating ownership information into that, which means you can see plot boundaries, which starts to make everything a bit easier. There used to be a project in New York called like 596 acres that showed all of the vacant public land in New York that was really helpful for community growing, but they went bust as well, I think. Often, something we really want to do with Land Explorer is kind of like build in the ability for people to crowdsource stuff, because often it is that thing if somebody's been looking over a fence and or like that bit of land's been empty for bloody years. It's the kind of thing you end up talking about down the pub or in a cafe, and you're like, oh, maybe there's something we can do with that. But partly because of this land system that we live in, it's actually incredibly opaque. And it's not like that in every country. Lots of places will have much more transparent kind of land markets, but often, land when it becomes available is snapped up very quickly by people who know.
Is there somewhere for meanwhile spaces specifically as well?
There is a project called the Meanwhile Project,
okay.
Which landlords can bring in to then activate to sort of make meanwhile things happen. But no, there's no overall kind of database or anything.
Okay.
It would be great if there were, but the thing is, land is controlled by so many different people.
That
there's no, there's no overall coordination committee, as someone put in there.
Actually, I happen to be doing a mapping project with Tower Hamlets Council, mapping all the green spaces in Tower Hamlets. So if anybody, I'll probably send out the survey to everybody on the list. If you know of a green space or you run a green space, and then seeing where all that land is being used for food growing, and then maybe you can pick up the pockets in between and see.
And I think, the pockets in between stuff is partly where some of the interest, the bits of land that nobody quite realizes that anybody owns. And that's where I think local authorities do have a real role. I was talking to someone in Islington, and Islington's famously like the London borough with the least green space per head and like the fewest parks. But apparently it also has like 52 acres of housing land.
Right.
And, but like one of the classic things about local authorities is that the housing people and the parks people often just never talk to each other, especially in like when in Tower Hamlets, where it's all outsourced to the Almo. I worked for a while for a consultancy that was all about supporting tenants and residents when their houses were being transferred from council houses into housing association houses, and part of that was there was always a big mapping process about like what does the housing department own, and without fail they'd come up with at least 3 pubs and a park that they owned and nobody ever realized they did. Like there's a lot of kind of legacy stuff. So I think mapping and kind of bringing together all the different bits of the public sector that own land is a really useful thing to start with.
Okay, well, I think we're gonna wrap up. So if I didn't get to all your questions, then Kate has kindly said that she'll be able to answer some of your questions, and I can send that out to everyone. Thanks so much Kate, for all your like brilliant knowledge and experience and all your links. We'll send all those out as well. To Joe as well for supporting, and for everyone who's like written in with questions and getting involved, and getting involved in the chat as well, which is really good to see. And just a few closing points. The next network gathering from when is in May, and we'll share that in our newsletter. And if you're not on our local food newsletter, then just write to me to be added onto it, and that's at julie@wen.org.uk. And also I'll be sending out feedback kind of survey. That would be great if you could fill that in, please, so that we can keep on kind of putting out these events for free. And we'll send out the recording as well. Let me know if you want to see more of these as well. And yeah, I think that's it. Thanks so much, Kate. It was really, yeah, it's just so brilliant. I mean, obviously such a huge topic, can't cover everything, but I think we've got like kind of managed to do a broad scope of talking about land.
Yeah, I'm sorry it's not simpler. It's like a 5-step guide, and then we could all just go do it. But yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone. And I hope to see you all next time. Great.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.